Bud, I guess you're next. Is that true?
I think that's right.
That is correct.
Bud has been a GRC colleague from the get-go. He probably is the most effective citizen climate actor that I know of, certainly in the city of Boston he is. He used to run a little place called the New England Aquarium, but has since retired, or that's the phrase that he uses. But he's made it his business to learn everything there is to know about urban climate resilience, and all of us in Boston have benefited greatly from learning from Bud. Bud's co-chair of the GRC Climate Preparedness Working Group, along with Brian Koop. They have just finished a study focusing on how ready we are in Boston to implement resilience measures, using the Seaport as an example. And Bud is going to report on that a bit to this group. Bud?
Thank you, Amos. And I think the lesson from John Kerry is none of us can retire till we get this problem licked. So we got a way to go here. But I'm going to be very quick. I've got about 5 slides altogether, and I think it's a nice segue from John Kerry because he talked a lot about the inevitability of some of these problems, and unfortunately, sea level rise is one of those where it's already underway. You're looking at the cover here in Fort Point Channel, the cover of our report. This is where GE's headquarters was going to be. It's now a property going to be developed by National Development, but as you can see, there's only about 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet from the high tide to the walkway there. You may recall the city in 2018 completed one of its first neighborhood resilience plans, and that was the resilience plan for South Boston, including the Seaport area. That plan called for almost immediate action to address existing and imminent flood risks in some of the areas of the South Boston Seaport area. So that having been completed in 2018, we at the Green Ribbon Commission thought it would be a good idea to sort of track, to look at that study again a year later and see whether it has stimulated action, and particularly look at what might need to be done by both private property owners and the city to move quickly to implement the early actions that were called for in that plan. So GRC, the Green Ribbon Commission, and my working group led this study. We contracted Arcadis to do the consulting work. They did a spectacular job on the report. It's available on the Green Ribbon Commission website, but I'm going to just take you through some of the key findings before we move to the mayor. So the questions that prompted the study were really 3 basic ones. Given that this was an area that needs immediate action, what flood protection actions are already underway or planned by individual property owners in the Seaport study area? Where and why are there gaps in those actions? And most importantly, what governance, funding, and regulatory changes are needed to advance individual and or collective actions within the required time frame? So I'm going to talk to you about the work that we did was focused on these 3 questions. A little bit of a reminder, nobody needs a reminder actually that the Seaport is one of the most low-lying and therefore most vulnerable areas in the city. I don't know if the different colors of blue come through on your screen, but the really dark blue are the areas and the flood pathways currently exposed to flooding or exposed within the next decade. So you can see a good part of the Seaport is already vulnerable, and then the lighter blue is what will happen by 2070 if we don't close off those flood pathways. Our particular study focused on 2 of the areas most vulnerable in the Seaport, one being Fort Point Channel and one being Seaport Boulevard. In each of those 2 areas, the 2018 plan that the city completed called for the creation of a landscape berm, an elevated harbor walk, or other kinds of barriers along those segments, depending on what was feasible and what would be cost effective to close off those key flood pathways. At the time, it was projected that in each of the 2 areas shown on the screen, the cost would be $35 to $50 million for creating each of those landscape berms or other kinds of barriers. Those costs do not include floodproofing the individual buildings on each of those properties. And if you look at the total cost projected for the entire South Boston district, those were $500 million to $1 billion overall. And this we plotted assume that the construction happened on the timeline that was suggested in the 2018 report, this would be what those capital expenditures and the operating and maintenance costs would look like over the next several decades. So this is a major challenge in this area that needs focus on quite immediately. I think one of the most important things we did in this study are with our consultants, and John and I interviewed 14 of the major property owners along Four Point Channel and Seaport Boulevard, and also some of the tenants in those areas. I think most importantly, the good news is that virtually everyone there is aware of the increased flood risk in these areas, but not always sure how best to respond. Several are moving forward with implementation, and many are willing actually to pay for solutions on their properties. So I think both the initial Climate Ready Boston work, as well as the floods we had in 2018, really woke a lot of people up quite effectively. And so it's good to understand that we're well over the hump in terms of people recognizing that this is a problem. Many of the property owners that we interviewed see a need for collective governance and funding solution that is both fair and equitable. By being fair, there are questions about if I fix my property and make it more resilient along the waterfront and it protects people inland from me, shouldn't they be asked to pay also? Others raise questions about equity. What if various tenants or property owners along in the Seaport area are unable to pay? How will we accommodate them? How can we get help and make sure we provide the protection they need? I think most importantly, everyone spoke to the need for more coordination, particularly across contiguous properties. So while a lot of individual property owners were taking action, there were a lot of questions about what's my neighbor doing? How do I know that he and she are going to the same target elevations? How do we know that we're going to have a continuous line of defense across our property? So I think that's perhaps one of the most important findings, the need for more coordination, even though most everybody thought the city had done a really fine job to date in identifying the challenges and the problems that need to be addressed. Through our work, we also concluded in looking at the existing regulatory environment that it should be possible to get the urgent projects that need to be done by 2025 implemented and completed. We need to maximize the effectiveness of existence governance, regulatory, and funding approaches, but we didn't see any major barriers in terms of the authorities for allowing that and enabling that to happen. Beyond that, as you look at the South Boston District as a whole, and remember there we're looking at $500 million to $1 billion worth of projects, and if you look across the city, maybe a couple of $1 billion or more of flood protection measures and resilience measures along the waterfront, we probably need to look at a more robust set of governance systems that will need to be put in place as the complexity and scale of the problem increases. Beyond that, whatever we do, it's also clear to us that the city needs additional human and financial resources to manage implementation as we go forward. You know, I think many of us are always reluctant to create new agencies and, you know, why can't we do more with what we have? Why can't we be more efficient? It's really important to remember this is a brand new problem. There hasn't ever really been major flooding in the city of Boston, and as sea level continues and as the rate of sea level rise continues, the problem, its scale and complexity and the challenge increases. So we have to respond accordingly. And hang on just one second. So my last slide here, there are two sets of recommendations that we made, and we've had very good conversations with the city about these throughout the project, going back a year now. Track one is what I will just focus on today. These are the near-term recommendations that emerged from our study. Number one, establish a new senior level cabinet chief within the mayor's cabinet focused on climate resilience implementation. And equally important, we need not just create a new senior position, but we have to make sure that position has the appropriate capacity and resources that it needs to implement these projects. Planning has been done very well within EEOS and BPDA, and there are a number of good things underway, but we really felt it's time to sort of jumpstart implementation. As we move into construction, it's a whole different ballgame, and we needed to get started on that. Secondly, a lot of the property owners that we talked to sort of wondered about what the future of the resilience plans that have been done is, and whether they have any real teeth or regulatory authority. So we recommend that the city figure out some way to formally adopt those plans, particularly when the downtown plan and the Dorchester neighborhood plan are completed over the next few months. It will really be important whether, that could be adoption by the mayor or by BPDA and or EEOS, some way to sort of more formalize that these plans are now going into play, and their design and performance standards should be integrated with existing regulatory mechanisms.
Bud,
Yes,
I'm going to ask you to just summarize the rest of the recommendations
that's what I was going to do. Very
more quickly, because we have Mayor Walsh standing by.
Very good, great, okay. The city has the flood overlay district zoning process underway. That's really important to keep moving on. Just to mention, I think the two really things that need to be integrated throughout are setting the target flood elevations and making sure people are aware of the tie-ins they have to do with their neighbors. Lastly, I'll just mention that we need to continue with the kind of funding strategy. We need to work very carefully with the property owners who've agreed to pay for flood protection along their properties. And finally, I would say, I think a lot of what we identified as needs in the Seaport are easily and well applicable to other parts of the city along the waterfront. We look forward to working with the city and the property owners as we go forward to make all this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Bud. And the GRC will do some sort of presentation panel discussion on this. This is a very rich report. I urge you to read it from our website.